Good evening. Welcome to the Korea Society. Welcome to Studio Korea. We're delighted you could join us tonight, either here in our very intimate studio audience or online, either streaming or watching via podcast or YouTube. Thank you for joining us at the Korea Society, and please see our offers for membership as well as our opportunities ahead in programming at koreasociety.org. This evening, we have a real privilege to discuss further the issue of Korean politics and identity through one of the most remarkable members, I think, in the U.S. Korean American community, one of the early adoptees, and one of the people who has labored very tirelessly for Holt International, which did so much for so many years to bring children to the United States, which created a common bond, very deep and lasting bond. And by way of full disclosure, I have two siblings who were adopted through Holt. I'm eternally grateful to Susan and to the Holt organization for that, among my five Korean brothers and sisters. And what Susan and what Holt has done is truly one of the more remarkable stories of humanitarian affairs on the Korea-U.S. relations front. Susan very kindly had David Kim with us for the first of our Legacy series, where we recognize people who have made leading contributions in humanitarian affairs, corporate affairs, or policy. And we're just delighted that we could have tonight with us Susan Cox, who is the Korean Honorary Consul General for Oregon, as well as Vice President with Holt. She has a very rich policy background, policy exposure. She is very active in Washington, D.C., in The Hague, and we will get to all of that. But Susan, welcome. We're very delighted to have you here at the Korea Society.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for hosting the Korea Society in Oregon as part of our national program
It was
series.
our pleasure.
Thank you. We are really delighted to have you here. And in our initial discussions, you raised a very interesting proposition, which is that the first generation of Korean adoptees has begun to settle into its role as senior citizens in this society, and that means it's a time for sort of reflection on contribution and legacy and what Korea-U.S. relations have meant at that very personal level. And I'm wondering if you could start us off with some of your thoughts on where that community is and how it's impacting.
Well, first of all, I'm a little horrified at the whole idea that we are senior citizens, but in fact we are. So, that first generation, I like to think that we have come of age, and that's certainly true. There are a number of us who, as Korean adopted women, we consider ourselves as platinum, so that is where we are at this point.
Platinum status.
That's right. But we were certainly in the 1950s when I was adopted from Korea. It was at the very beginning. And I really think that adoption from Korea, unintended probably, but it really created an openness about adoption that had not happened before. That it was also in that era that adoption was done in secret, and that children were adopted by parents and matched. And matched meant that they looked like their parents. And so more often than not, those children were not told that they were adopted. But for Korean children being adopted by Caucasian families, that pretense was not possible. And so I think it split wide open, that whole concept of secrecy, and that's a unintended outgrowth of what happened in just absolutely finding children for families. And that was the beginning, certainly. And, that was six decades ago. And we know a lot more about what children need. We always consider at Holt that while we're known for intercountry adoption, and we feel like we do that very, very well, we certainly pioneered that concept. But our goal is to find families for children, not children for families. And to do that appropriately in a way that you prepare and educate the families. And, we started that in Korea, but that is a social practice that has expanded far beyond what was ever thought. And the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption, I think, is an example of the global reach that adoption that started in Korea has had.
And I'd like to get back to the Hague issue in a few minutes, but if I could ask you a little bit about that early period. Holt in and correct me if I'm wrong, in 2016 we'll be celebrating its 60th
Yes,
anniversary.
we will.
The Korea Society will be celebrating in 2017 its
Mhm.
60th anniversary.
Mhm.
Both the Korea Society, as an organization meant to educate Americans on Korea and enhance friendship and opportunities for
Right.
exchange, and Holt, which has its own unique brand of human
Mhm,
exchange
mhm.
and building families, do share that part of a common legacy. And just as General James Van Fleet grew this society out of an effort to assist war-torn Korea,
Right.
Holt laid a very rich framework out of the needs of the massive number of children who were left without parents at the end of the war.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that legacy, the legacy of Harry
Sure.
Holt, of David Kim, who we
Right.
made mention of.
Right. Well, certainly, Mr. and Mrs. Holt just watched a film. It was as simple as that. In 1955, it was children who were abandoned and orphaned as a result of the war. They were this very ordinary family in Cresswell, Oregon, which by any definition is rural America. They had 6 biological children, and they were haunted by what they had seen and what they remembered of children in Korea who were not, who were perishing
Mm.
simply because there weren't resources for them, and most of them at that time were mixed race. They were children of Korean mothers and UN soldier fathers, and in a society that was struggling for everyone, these children certainly were not given high consideration, and so. They had this very simple idea that children belonged in families, and they believed that a family's love could transcend issues of nationality and culture. And so, literally, they passed the Holt Bill, which was for, and it was called the Holt Bill for the Relief of Certain War Orphans. And they adopted 8 children, all of them under the age of 2. And when I think about, Mr. and Mrs. Holt were 50 and 51 years old, we would never allow or approve of a family to adopt 8 children, certainly not at one time, and certainly not at the age that the Holts were. And that really demonstrates what we've learned over the last 60 years. But at that time and in that moment, they provided families for the family for these children. And what it also did was to precipitate a social movement. People all
Mm.
over the country who saw these pictures and said, "How can we do what you have done?" And so I think it's an example of people who are determined and have passion for an idea and just move forward. And when you think about how I just came from Washington D.C., and when you are observing how difficult it is
Mm.
for people with good ideas, to come together and get anything accomplished, it's very difficult. So in those times when that bill was passed just in a matter of weeks, that's extraordinary.
Mm.
And so Holt was actually begun because a policy was changed, a law was created, and we have continued to work in that way, all of these years. And it's been had peaks and valleys. Certainly, intercountry adoption, when it began, was incredibly controversial. People were saying, "How can children of one race and nationality and culture be raised by families of another?" And it had not been done before, and so. It happened because it's also as simple as parents' love for a child. And then a generation later, as that first group of us grew up, we also realized that it isn't quite that simple. It's also important that the idea of race and culture and nationality is not to be severed. It's something that it's also important for children to carry with them and be embraced as they go throughout their life.
Mm. That's very, very inspiring. And one of the things that I think we give pause to is, here we are in 2014,
Mhm.
where we get on Korean Airlines, one of the world's leading airlines, or Asiana Airlines, and
Right.
it's such a comfortable, wonderful experience. And we're sitting here with great gratitude in the Samsung Conference Center.
Mhm.
Some of us drive Hyundais or Kias, and we identify Korea as the sophisticated place and
That it
leader in the
is,
region that
yes.
it is. But when Holt started,
Mhm.
it was a risk and a real labor. And when you read David Kim's book about those early days,
Mhm.
the fact that the northern route, those planes had to stop 5 times with all
Right.
the infants, and 3 times on the southern route, that children were lost at
Mhm.
times in those early days between disease, having boarded weak, or altitude or cold,
Mhm.
that they, I mean, it was really just an amazing testimonial, I think, to human spirit.
Mhm.
And all these years later, as we applaud and are amazed by Korea for its development, to think back to that
Mhm.
time
Mhm.
is very intriguing, and to
Right.
think of that sacrifice.
Sure.
It,
Well, I consider myself very fortunate to have a direct link to that beginning. And I was almost 5 years old when I was adopted. I was found by Harry Holt in an orphanage in Incheon. And he had been told by the orphanage director that they had more babies than they had beds, and
mm,
could he help them? And his response was, I don't have a lot of room, but I can take 5 children.
mm,
And so he drove to Incheon and he decided which 5 children he would take home. And generally, he would take the child that was most at risk. Mr. Holt had a real compassion for those children that other people overlooked, or they would say, this child is already not likely to survive, so we need to move on to children who our help will make a difference. But on this particular day, one of the children that he took back with him was not a baby and not starving. It was a little girl about 5 years old, and her name was Hong Soon Goom, and she became Susan Gorley. And today I'm Susan Cox. And I can still remember that to that little 5-year-old girl, he was a pretty
mm,
imposing figure, and in pictures, you can see that Mr. Holt had eyebrows that just really hardly separated in the middle, and I can remember looking up at him and him looking down at me, and, I felt that he looked very fierce.
mhm,
And yet underneath all of those eyebrows was an amazing, kind and loving heart, which, I was able to know even as a little girl. So,
mm,
Mr. Holt was my, father before, knew me before my mother and father, and so I've always been very grateful to have that, particular link to him in my life.
mm,
And one of the things that, people have asked me, "Gee, what it was like to grow up being the only Korean." Um, I was the only Asian, not only the only Korean, and at that time, it was, the only experience I knew. And so it felt quite ordinary because I didn't know anything else. And I'm the oldest of 5 children. My parents adopted a little boy from Korea the year after and then had 3 biological children. But we were all the Gorley kids.
mhm,
And so it didn't ever occur to me that I was so unusual or so different. I mean, I certainly knew that I was Korean. I knew I was different from other people in my community. But looking back, it wasn't until I was an adult and I was exposed to going to Korea, being with other Koreans, that I realized that I was isolated in some ways. But it also, I think it's a balance. You have
mm,
to. I guess I choose to look at things and in a way that's optimistic in terms of that. And having been back to Korea, you talk about what Korea was like in the 50s when Mr. Holt went there for the first time. But I visited for the first time in 1976,
mm,
and Korea's not recognizable compared to those days. And I will never forget the first time walking into an orphanage. And I was a very young woman, and I don't think you can adequately prepare yourself for that experience. And I remember children, running up and grabbing you and wanting you to pick them up and hug them. And I I remember still thinking how it must have been for Mr. Holt
mhm,
in those early days when, the children that he touched their lives, and if he was able to, perhaps, give them a new life, and if he had to walk past them knowing what their life might be like.
mm,
So it was, you can go back to Korea, many, many times than I have, but you can only go back the first time once, and
mm.
and I will never forget that.
Amazing. You were very kind to have the Korea Society staff for a walkthrough of Holt during the Korea Society's national program in Oregon. And you have a lovely office, beautiful pictures from the White House with the president and the first lady and others. But you have something that struck me as fascinating, maybe unusual, and that's the Western Union telegram about your arrival. Could you
Right.
could you share with our studio
Sure.
audience
Sure. One of the
what you
things,
think of?
yeah, I have my parents. We always certainly. I knew that I could talk about my adoption whenever I wanted to. It was certainly a very open conversation. But I can remember when I left home, and at some point, my mom giving me all the records and all my information. I had seen all of that as I was growing up, but one of the documents that was there was this telegram, and it was from the Holt Agency to my parents, and it was the arrival of your orphan and the date that I was coming. And I think it was like $248, would they please forward for the ticket. And then later there's a letter that has a check in it, or a memo of a check of a refund that actually the ticket wasn't that much money. And I thought, when you consider what adoption costs today, that was a pretty remarkable sum of money. But I have the passport, certainly, that I came from to the U.S., and it's Korean. And, this pitiful little picture of me as a little girl. But this telegram that says to my parents that your daughter is on her way. And it just, I keep it on the wall to just remind me of where I've come and how I got here.
Mm. And you are in an amazing place. As I've mentioned, you have White House invitations, presidential photos in your office. You are someone so supremely and widely respected in Washington for your humanitarian efforts, and you have made that contribution in places like The Hague. Could you tell us your thoughts about working as a vice president of policy and external relations, how you advocate in centers of power, and what some of your experiences and reflections on Washington to The Hague have been?
I think you're very gracious in how you describe me. But, one of the things that I consider to be a real blessing in my life, I certainly didn't grow up in Brownsville, Oregon, thinking, and when I grow up, I'm going to go work at Holt and help children and families come together. That did not. That wasn't my dream. I hadn't even thought of it. But I was the first adoptee to be appointed to the board of directors, and part of that is because I'm so old and so at the beginning of that process. But they had a very platinum, right? But we had a very forward-thinking executive director in Jack Adams, and he said, we've been placing kids now for more than 20 years, and we need to know, what do they think? What are their thoughts? And so I was very privileged to be the first person adopted to serve in that capacity. And so that was my introduction really to being involved with Holt, and then over time came to work at Holt. So I consider it an enormous blessing to have a job that I go to every day, that it's also something that I can be so personally passionate about. And in the beginning, I can remember my very first board meeting in 1976. And one of the things that we discussed was the fact that Korea was quite concerned about the whole notion of intercountry adoption, and that they felt strongly that it should be discontinued. And so this was in 1976. And as long as I can remember, that's a conversation that has been taking place. Sadly, I think even now, I think that Koreans don't adopt because they don't know about it. They don't adopt because, for some reason, they're not ready or prepared to do that. But in about the 1980s, the Hague Convention, the Permanent Bureau, was feeling very strongly that there needed to be an international treaty that governed intercountry adoption. There were great concerns about abuses, and particularly from European countries, that the idea that there needed to be a level playing field, there needed to be a very strong system of checks and balances. So I was one of the people in that very first meeting at the State Department when they talked about the Hague Treaty, what it would mean, and it was frankly alarming to a lot of people. Like, what would these regulations mean? What would happen? And so the the Hague Convention was established in 1993. That the treaty was finally crafted, and the U.S. Adopted and ratified the treaty in 2004, I believe. And it took a very long time, but what it has provided is a process by which adoption from whatever country has standards and practices that everyone can accept and have accepted, the countries that have signed on. And so that was about the same time that also became very clear that instead of just waiting for policies to happen and that as an organization Holt would react to them, that it was really important that we take much more of a leadership role. And so I've had the real pleasure of being in that position since about the 1980s. And one of the things that we really struggle with is, and certainly the most recent thing that I can think of that has affected adoption is the Reuters stories in last fall that talked about the incidents of rehoming and some of the abuses that have happened with intercountry adoption. And whenever that happens, whether you are an organization that does good work or an organization that does terrible work, you all sort of get put into the same basket. And so we feel strongly that we have a responsibility and an obligation to make sure that the standards around which adoption takes place are unquestionable, because the children deserve that. They need to know as they're growing up and into adulthood that the family that they have grown up with is the family they were intended to have. It wasn't that they were snatched from a birth mother or they were taken out of their family for some reasons that were not legitimate or ethical.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit on that point more about policy and public perception and attitudes. You mentioned even as early as 1976, when Korea was still very much a developing country, that those attitudes had surfaced and concerns about adoption. I know from time there in the 1980s, in the 1990s, some of those attitudes hardened. There was misinformation. Those of us who had spent time with adoptees, who had had families with adoptees, were often asked to give, even if informally, sort of testimonials or share experiences. And whereas we generally look at it as a very positive story in Korea-U.S. relations, overcoming misinformation, prejudices is a real challenge.
Sure.
And how have you dealt with that at both a professional and a personal level?
Well, adoption's complicated. It isn't a particularly simple idea. And one of the things that has happened as adoption has changed, the practices have certainly improved. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that can continue to improve and be better. But one of the things that, frankly, I struggle with is, while there certainly are people in Korea, Koreans, who feel quite strongly that intercountry adoption should not be continued, I believe that too, if all of the children born in Korea could have families. But if the alternative is an institution, to me that isn't even a reasonable question. So while the population, those who are offended by or disapprove of intercountry adoption, I think they have a responsibility to step up and make changes and to accept those children into their families. One of the things that Korea has done for the last decade is to provide incentives for families to adopt. I mean, they very much want to stop Korean adoption, and by providing incentives to Korea, hope that will elevate the number of domestic adoptions. And frankly, it certainly has not kept up with the level of children who are being born without families. And the idea of a single mother in Korea being able to successfully parent is still very, very difficult. And it isn't that a birth mother doesn't necessarily want to do that. It's just that in that society, it's still very hard. Um, I was in Korea, about a month ago, and one of the things that we were talking about was um, the number of children who are being born now, and the most recent law about a year ago that says if a woman gives birth that she has to register the child in the family registry. The fear of an unwed mother to do that in terms of being identified are so great that the incidence of abandonment has really risen a lot. And so, to me, one of the things that I find disappointing is in a country that is so remarkable in so many ways, they are still, in fact, the incidence of abandonment in Korea is taking them back to a period that's more reminiscent of the 1960s.
Mm.
And I find that very disappointing. Is the goal adoption? Absolutely not.
Mhm.
And the goal is actually for children to stay in the families that they're born to. But the reality is that's simply not possible for an awful lot of children. And they should not bear the responsibility of society that isn't ready for them to be out there on their own. I mean, I often think of Pearl Buck and her book, The Good Earth, where she talks about the children who survive under those kinds of circumstances are the ones who are the most resilient, many times are the brightest, the smartest, and they can become the most angry and the most defiant. And I don't think that that's a legacy that Korea wants, and it certainly isn't a positive result at all for individual lives.
Mhm. And I know this may be a basic question,
Mhm.
but what is it? Is it fear around the bloodline
I think
and
it's
the
still the whole
shame?
confusion,
Is it
yes.
is it also economic that we're a modern society with a per capita now that puts
Mhm.
it almost at an advanced
Well, Korea
society?
Korea certainly has, if not the lowest, one of the lowest birth rates in the world, and so that's a reality. But they also, I mean, it's a country that, I mean, there are no fewer children being born to unwed mothers today than there were a year ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, and so Korean used to look at intercountry adoption as a possibility for children for whom there were no families in Korea. And so, with the idea that families have to now, a birth mother has to now put her name into a registry, has really changed it. And so, when you talk about adoption, it's very controversial, and controversial among those of us who were adopted. I mean, there have been something like 200,000 children adopted from Korea. So, it isn't possible, I don't think, to make generalities. And so we're all going to have different ideas and thoughts and feelings based on who we are as individuals. But I would say that for the most part, certainly in my experience, people who have been adopted, they may not think that their family was perfect. I don't think many people do think their family is perfect, but they also think that having a family was preferred over um, growing up in orphanage or institution. And that is certainly the belief that I have. And part of that is reinforced so strongly by the children I have seen and I saw a month ago in Korea. My first visit to Korea, I was in my early 20s. And I remember seeing children, young people at the orphanage. We were the same age. And by some um, act of fate, I had been adopted, I'd had a family, and they had not.
Mm.
And I remember at the time feeling so badly about what was the reality of their lives every day. And even though they were at the Holt Center, they were under the care of Molly Holt, they had a good life considering all of the things that were against them. But I remember feeling a little guilty about that.
Mm.
And I knew it wasn't my fault. I knew it wasn't anything I had done, but I still couldn't quite forget what that was like. And over the years, when I have gone back to Korea, I always try to go to Ilsan. And in the past 4 decades, I have seen those people grow up. And we are a mirror in terms of our age and how differently our lives have been. They can continue to live at Ilsan, and I have become a mom. I'm now happily a grandmother. My life has been very different, and it's because of family. And I don't. One of the things I feel very strongly about is that I didn't. I didn't leave Korea to come to the United States. I left Korea to come to a family.
Mm.
And I think that's a very important distinction. And for those of us who are adopted, whether it's from Korea or any other country, while we may not have grown up in the country of our birth, that connection that we have, I don't believe is ever fully severed in any way. And if it's something that you want to embrace and know more about and really become a part of, that's something that you can choose to do. And the benefits of family give you so many possibilities that you simply don't have in an orphanage growing up.
Mm. Thank you, Susan. That's fascinating. Before turning to the studio audience, if I could ask one last question. And we've talked about the education challenge with the public. How do you educate Washington?
Well, actually, there are a number of people, policymakers, members of Congress, who have personally experienced adoption. And frankly, one of the odd dichotomies is that there are some people who feel like adoption no matter what, and we certainly don't feel that way. There was proposed legislation a few years ago that to adopt children from North Korea. That was an outrageous idea. First of all, you have to have a relationship between two countries for that to happen. One of the reasons we feel so strongly about the Hague Convention and the appropriateness of laws and policies that protect children is because not every child is adoption is not the first line of defense for children. It's in terms of poverty, in terms of unrest in countries, adoption is not the answer. It is an answer for some small segment of children. But first of all, efforts need to be made to keep children in families. And so unapologetically, we also say that for some children, intercountry adoption is appropriate, and that should not be discarded as an opportunity. But in Washington, it's actually I think it isn't so difficult to find people who are supportive of adoption, but it's difficult to find people who are interested in supporting post-adoption services and the kinds of programs that ensure that adoption is viable and that families are supported and have the services that they need. One of the things that I always think about is adoption and child welfare is a pretty bipartisan issue. Several years ago now, but Tom DeLay and Hillary Clinton proposed legislation together. And so I've always thought, wow, if those two can put together legislation together and come together about an idea, mutually understanding it. And so frankly, many times that's what I actually find is that people who wouldn't come together on any other issue will come together around the issues of children. And for that, I'm very grateful.
And Susan, we thank you for your eloquence again tonight, and we have for you a selection of different books that the Korea Society has either assembled or profiled
Wonderful.
here.
Thank you.
All of which I think will strike your fancy in different ways. We're very grateful to you for having come up from Washington, for having journeyed out from the West Coast. We look forward to having you back here in New York
I would like
for
that.
the Honorary Consul General's meeting, which I believe is in November or December,
fall,
you mentioned,
yes.
This fall. And I know you serve our country and Korea, and maybe most importantly, you serve those children so very, very well.
I hope so.
And thank you for that. It's very inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Susan Cox.